This is Crumbs Brewing, a beer company based in Surrey in the UK. Since the company was founded in 2017, they've received significant attention. Why? Well, in part because they brew their beer from bread waste, something which reduces land required for barley production and captures value in a product that would otherwise be wasted. We'll hear from Morgan Arnell, their co-founder, later in the video. The idea of brewing beer from bread is not as new as you might think. Beer and bread share a deep historical connection stretching all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. Examples of historic beers like Boozer from Egypt and Kvass from northeastern Europe were in fact directly made from bread. In ancient Egypt, beer and bread were often produced in the same buildings, and until the Industrial Revolution, most bakers sourced their yeast from breweries. Fast forward to the 21st century and the industries have become more separated, but both beer and bread remain a staple of most diets. In fact, beer is the third most consumed beverage in the world, surpassed only by water and tea. This means that within the craft beer industry in particular, brewers are forever looking at ways to differentiate themselves. And something that's resurfaced as a result is this concept of brewing beer using bread. A problem with bread as a food is that it has a relatively short shelf life. It's estimated that 10% of all bread baked in Europe is wasted, which adds up to around 10 million tonnes a year. In the UK alone, the equivalent of 20 million slices of bread are wasted every single day. So using this waste then as a feedstock for another industry poses an interesting opportunity. But how does one actually brew beer from bread? To answer this, I spoke with Morgan Arnell, who, as I said, is one of the co-founders of Crumbs Brewing.
You start off with what's called a mash, where normally you mix up malted barley and hot water, stir that around for a little bit, the sort of the sugary liquid that you get from that, you drain that off, and then that's what you boil with hops, typically, that give beer its sort of aroma and its sort of bitter flavours. You boil it with hops, and then that final sugary liquid is what you then throw into a fermenter, add yeast and ferment it into beer. So that's sort of the three very basic stages.
Now, Morgan talks about replacing the malt or malt barley with bread. But what actually is this malt barley? Basically, the barley in beer production acts as both a source of starch and a source of enzymes that break down this starch. These enzymes become activated when the barley is allowed to germinate in what is known as the malting process. It's these enzymes that convert the starches in the barley to simple sugars, which are then turned into alcohol in the beer during fermentation. So in using the bread in place of barley, we can provide a source of starch, but not a source of enzymes, which limits the amount of bread we can use. Both Toast Brewing and Crumbs Brewing, the two biggest bread-to-beer players in the UK, limit their bread content to 25%. But as Morgan explains here, there are also some practical factors that influence this figure.
Normally when you brew with grain is kind of hard grain that you mix up with water, and because you drain the liquid off once you've mixed it up, the fact that grain's hard is very helpful. It gets a bit softer once it's been mixed around for a while, but it's still, is quite a firm mixture that then when you want to, basically with a mash tun, you have like a sieve at the bottom that then you open up and it drains the liquid off. When you do that with malt, it's very simple and they've done it for thousands of years. When you start throwing bread in the mix, it gets a lot sloppier, a bit more like porridge. So there's a practical reason as well in terms of if you go much beyond 25%, it becomes a lot harder to deal with. So again, we learned the hard way. You get what's called a stuck mash. If the mixture gets too sloppy, you just can't drain enough liquid off, so you don't get as good a yield out of your mash.
Now, one thing I was curious about as well is whether there are any limits on the type of bread that can be used for this purpose. Funnily, this is one of the areas that Crumbs say sets them apart in this emerging sub-industry. The Crumbs beer range is each brewed with a different type of bread, ranging from sourdough to rye to naan bread. The bread also has to be pre-processed before brewing. In the product development stages, Crumbs experimented with toasting and crumbing the bread, as well as how best to store it before it's turned to beer.
We learnt in our mashing trials is actually if you crumb the bread before you put it into the process, it kind of helps because you're starting to break down that bread and start to break down, give the process the ability to break down the starches, etc., in the bread. So you crumb it, put it in is a better way to do it than just sort of throwing in slices or whatever. Typically, when we crumb it, we then dry it. If you get it down to a certain moisture content, it has two big benefits. One is you can store it just dry, and B, the brewer actually prefers it when it's dry because, again, one of the things they need to do in the brewing process is understand, the level of liquid and moisture that's going into any brew, because that's quite an important element for it.
Another challenge of incorporating circular principles like this in the food industry is the issue of traceability and allergens. If you're using waste bread from many different suppliers, you need to know exactly what's going into the beer and make sure to label that accordingly.
What we try to do quite successfully is the bakers that we do work with. So either it's a thing like the naan bread, it's the naan only goes into one beer and we only get it from one supplier at the moment. With things like our sourdough pale ale, which might have sourdough from sort of Hobbs House or from Chalk Hills, again, we've made sure that actually they're both what you would call real bread bakers that are making their sourdough in the same way, using pretty much the same ingredients, and it's sort of those ingredients that you reflect on the label, etc. And also, quality. We don't want to be throwing in a load of bread that's got 1,000,001 preservatives in with a nice white bloomer that's made by an artisan baker. So
now, whilst brewing beer with bread is of course primarily about reducing food waste and reducing land use for barley, it is interesting to look at carbon dioxide emissions as well. Toast Brewing's 2023 impact report revealed a carbon savings of only 3.5% from using bread in the process. Another study found that a sourdough pale ale recipe with 60% by weight of bread was only able to reduce the global warming potential, or equivalent carbon dioxide emissions, by 7.13%. For a contract brewer like Crumbs or Toast, Scope 3 emissions, those from the processes they don't directly control, play an important role in their overall environmental impact.
We've always been open to the fact that we need to look at that broader picture, and we need to challenge ourselves to address elements of that bigger picture as well. So ironically, actually, we have been working, so our main brewer at the moment that does our sort of core range is a brewery called Crafty, who ironically, literally 3 days ago, announced that they just acquired a new brewery and are moving to a site called Hepworth. So Hepworth is a brewery in Sussex.
Hepworth Brewery is trialling the UK's first steam generating heat pump, cost effectively recovering low-grade waste vapour from brewing and redelivering this as steam at 130 degrees for the heat-intensive parts of the brewing process. The brewery is also set to install an anaerobic digester to convert the organic matter in the wastewater into biomethane. Alongside solar panels, rainwater recovery and local ingredient sourcing, these innovations put Hepworth on track to achieve 85% carbon neutrality by 2025. Crumbs also collaborated with the University of Surrey to do a full life cycle assessment of their products. And one of the things that came out of this was the use of cans over bottles, even though this might not always be to the delight of the consumer. Primarily, the benefit of cans comes from the reduced weight and the more efficient packing capabilities for transport. Crumbs estimate that cans have half the carbon dioxide emissions of an equivalent bottle, taking both material and transport into account.
When you bake in not just the process of the materials, but the process of the weight and the shipping and all that kind of malarkey, and the sort of the recyclability elements of aluminium versus can. I hadn't really appreciated how much of a positive impact being in can was versus being in bottle. So yeah, we kind of took it to say, look, actually we want our core business to be 100% in cans. As a result, we've lost some customers and we've pissed off some consumers because some people just don't like drinking out of cans.
As I mentioned already, the more bread that's used in the beer, the less alcohol that's produced. But that also presents exciting opportunities for companies like Crumbs. UK sales of non-alcoholic beer have increased 5-fold over the last decade alone. And Morgan says there might actually be a taste advantage in using bread for this process.
A really interesting thing, and which we're sort of we've had one play with so far is this whole rationale is if you put more bread in, your brew becomes less efficient. Therefore, you make a lower alcohol beer. Really. So if you roll that process all the way through, you actually get less alcohol out the end. So the main issue with low alcohol or zero alcohol beers is they can sometimes be a bit thin and watery because they don't have that sort of depth of ingredients that go into them, or some breweries, they will distill off the alcohol, which again sort of thins out the mouth profile of the beer. Interestingly, by sticking a load more bread in it, it actually the liquid itself sort of retains a little bit of depth, and you get a really nice sort of delicious beer, even though it's zero alcohol kind of thing. So or lower alcohol. We went down to 2.5%, I think, at 50%. So we're going to now look at how can we push that even further, or are there ways we can get it down to sort of to zero? It gets me excited because it means you hopefully utilize more waste bread, but also you have the potential to make a product in a unique way that ultimately should make a better product at the end of the day. So, and that to me is always the sweet spot of it can't just be good for the planet, it's also got to be delicious, or the person that's going to buy it's got to see that it's more interesting or better than an alternative kind of thing.
But this, of course, comes with its own challenges.
Again, it's tricky to do. So the trial brew we did was, to my point earlier about you put more bread in, it becomes far easier to deal with. It's a lot harder to deal with than a 25% brew. But we think you can overcome some of those challenges. So again, that's why we'd love to do it in partnership with a bigger brewer we can overcome some of those. We haven't yet tried it at scale, basically.
On a more reflective note, something else that came out of this conversation was this idea that sustainable businesses cannot have this as their sole USP. The product they're producing needs to be high quality and desirable as well. For Crumbs, this is one of their strongest drivers. Sure, people might buy their beer out of curiosity initially, but they'll only come back if the beer tastes great. They may use waste bread in their beer, but as I was told, it's in the ethos of brewers to be very specific and consistent with the ingredients they choose. And so bread from local artisan bakers has been favoured for this use. Finally, Morgan spoke to the importance of honesty in sustainable business.
It is what I was saying earlier, is we're very careful about sort of not claiming that we're saving the planet sort of just through throwing some bread into the brewing process. If you look at the brewing process and all the things around it, whether it's packaging or whatever, our emissions and our impact on the planet is far more massively, or equally massively impacted by those things as it is by the fact that we're replacing a bit of malt with some leftover bread.
Brewing beer with bread might not be the solution to all the world's problems, but it serves up a refreshing example of how creative circular thinking can bring about small positive change. That, if repeated across all industries, might just change the world. I'm Luke, and this was The Upshift.